communities and our cities. But also, it's so much going on in the world just now that we thought, why don't we get someone in here who can tell us a little bit more about, what is really happening and what could be the implications of these things, because it is really affecting all of us. And we are so lucky. We got a fantastic speaker to join us here today. It's Elisabeth Holvik. She's the chief economist in Sparebank, and she will give us a little bit of her view on what is going on now. How is this affecting us? Elisabeth, are you online? Floor is yours.
Thank you. Let's just get the slides up and running. Can you see the charts?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Okay, so my aim today is to kind of try to put together the bits and pieces of information that you read about in the news to get it into a bigger context. And I think it's impossible to understand the conflict in Ukraine without having this as a broad back kind of a back picture to the conflict. To the left is one of my favorite cartoons. It's the American eagle looking at the Chinese dragon and asking, have you put on weight recently? And this illustrates the struggle between the great powers in the world. And we know from the history that periods of where you have one superpower that determines the rules and secure the rules by military force, that has historically been a very stable period for world trade and for globalization. We have, over the last 10 years, since the financial crisis in 2008, seen globalization going into reverse, and we are entering a period where we could see more conflict, trade wars, and multipolarity, which is kind of more different powers trying to get influence in the world. This is a chart from Ray Dalio, who has looked at this historic change of superpowers, because it has happened before, several times actually. This is the chart showing the superpowers of the world going back to the 15th century. Back then it was China. So China just wants to return to their former glory. During the 16th century, the Netherlands invented the stock market, shares, and had a fantastic innovation in shipbuilding. And they started the Dutch East Asia Company, so they monopolized the trade in the world. The next shift in superpower were the UK with the Industrial Revolution, and by the use of the rivers and electricity all year round, they managed to combine great innovation and renewable energy, actually, to build a great power in the world. And they ruled the sea. After the Second World War, US took over and set the rules for the economy and the United Nations, World Trade Organization, that we have benefited from since the Second World War. As you can see in red, that's China's combined power, increasing very rapidly and challenging the US. If you decompose what's making a great power, it usually starts with a very advanced and good education, which eventually leads to more innovation, better technology. The economy becomes more competitive, and you will also get the financial center, and people want to trade in the superpowers currency, since that's accepted worldwide. As you can see, the reserve status of the economy is something that's kind of in the late phase of the area of the superpower, because that's habit. You used to trade in that currency, and that's where the rules and the trade system and the SWIFT system and the central bank system is oriented around. Today, China is to the left. They are still building their power. They have fantastic education system. They are very innovative. They have great technology, more advanced in some sectors than the US. And they are building their military power rapidly. US is in decline. And I think the shock for the US was in when they were going to implement the 5G system, and they realized that the most advanced technology was Chinese. And the US could not accept that the military technology was based on US components. China has a very long-term strategy, and they have for many years tried to avoid using the US dollar. They are trying to build their own sphere of currency where central banks locally can use the Chinese currency and avoid using the dollar. So the paradox today is that the way the West now is sanctioning Russia could be an incentive for other countries to change out of the dollar, since they could also be sanctioned going forward in a couple of years, decades. So to be safe, they will probably going to change into crypto, to gold, to the Chinese currency. Russia and China has formed a very strong alliance. They are best friends and they meet regularly. And in a way, China and Russia are a perfect match. China has a lot of industry, a lot of capital, and Russia has the material and the energy. I think also a way to understand what's going on in Russia is to understand how devastating the collapse of the Soviet area was for the identity for people living in Russia. To the left, you can see the risk of death for Russian men, and it has a lot to do with alcohol. So alcoholism in Russia exploded, and people kind of lost their way, what to believe in. And as a consequence, when you're drunk, it's not easy to perform and make babies. So birth rate collapsed in Russia. So one of the things that Putin has really put his effort into is to be a healthy role model. And that's probably why you see him without shirts on so many nature pictures. And as you can see, it has had some effect, lower alcoholism and increased birth rate. And I think this is something that we have to contemplate. What do people believe in as a kind of a trigger for future conflicts? And I would really recommend a book by Samuel Huntington called Clashes of Civilization. And he postulated that, for instance, when the Soviet area collapsed, people needed something else to believe in than communism. Communism failed. So what to believe in? So they went back to history, back to their culture, to the religion. So Huntington defines different type of civilization, and that is a contradiction to the mainstream idea that when the communist, the Soviet area and the Berlin Wall fell, the West won. And if we just showed them how fantastic we have it in the West, everyone would like to be like us. Everyone wanted to be democratic, liberal, human rights, etc. And that's also why we in 2001 allowed the Chinese economy to enter the World Trade Organization on special terms. So they came in as a developing country and have a lot of benefits. It's not trading on equal terms with the West. And we did that assuming that the Chinese society would be liberal, democratic, and become like us. Country after country have decided that they don't want that. China don't want to be democratic, they don't want to be liberal. Russia does not like the West. Islam does not want to be like the West. So this is something to change your view on what you believe in is really hard. But I think we in the West need to contemplate, is this something that could trigger more conflicts going forward? When it comes to China, they are probably the only country thinking that global warming is something that's good, because it will lead to an ice-free Arctic, and they could have trade routes through the Arctic. So if you remember when Trump wanted to buy Greenland, that was a response to China buying up a lot of infrastructure and companies in Greenland. So China has positioned itself for this global trade with Belt and Road Initiative on train, on water, on land, and also on the digital Silk Road. So China is strategically getting into all these technical committee defining the new generation of technology standard. And that's very important, because if we can get global standards, the one that has already that standard will be the winner. So Huawei is kind of today's Dutch Royal East Asia company. It's part of the aim to rule the world digitally. So the response from the US came in October 2020 with a new military strategy, where they also included the technology development in the private sector. And this is something that Norway, as a NATO country, needs to adapt. Europe has already adapted it and has taken measures. And I think this is something that we, as a early mover in a lot of technologies, can benefit from, to kind of align us with other allies and to develop technology that's aligned to this NATO strategy. The Achilles heel of the West is debt and weak productivity growth. Over time, you can only grow a country as much as the productivity growth, but short term, if you have access to credit, you can of course borrow and spend or invest, but then it's super important what you use the money. Do you invest it in building factories, innovation, education? Fine, that's increasing productivity. But I think we have to be honest that in the West, we have used a lot of that credit for fun, traveling, building houses, and letting people off, outsourcing production to China, and spending the money on real estate, to put it on a very, in Europe, they have been underinvesting in safe energy and been totally dependent on Russian gas. This is just to show you the size of the problem. The blue is how much Russian gas comes into Europe today, and the dark blue is possible sources to replace it. The most likely source is the LNG, but then you need to build a new harbor to get the floating gas into the country, and you have to build new infrastructure. It's also a law in Germany, for instance, that if there is a lack of energy, industry might have to close down their production. If that should happen today, Germany will go into a recession. It will be devastating for the German economy. So this is the reason why Europe can't really turn off the Russian gas. Short term, it's impossible to replace it with something else. And this is the key. I'm quoting Hans Werner Sinn, one of the most respected economists in Germany, who calls the German energy vendor for a fiasco, because they have turned off the safe production of stable energy. and invested only in renewable energy, but that is not safe when it's not wind, not sun, and it's cold. So you need a stable source of energy. And I think in a couple of years, we will see a lot of new nuclear plants in Europe. The central banks have finally hiked rates due to the massive inflationary pressure from the war, but also from how the West have solved the earlier crisis. Both the COVID and the financial crisis in 2008 was solved by extreme stimulus measure. Interest rate level 0. They were printing money. They were using a lot of money over the fiscal budgets, increasing debt to extremely high level. All the regulation with the green transition, it's a cost driver. It's also increasing demand for energy, for minerals and raw materials. And the geopolitical tension has induced a lot of companies to change from the just-in-time logistic to just-in-case logistic. More warehouse. You have to move the production to the allied countries. And we need to build more energy safety, which is also now driving up energy prices, oil prices, and you have to build new infrastructure in Europe. So if you look at the interest rate levels going forward, you can see in the US that the blue, the market expects the central bank to hike rates quite rapidly to about 2 to 3% in the next 2 years. And the market expects the central bank to hike rates as high as it takes to stop inflation from growing. And the way you do that is that you have to slow down the economy and allow unemployment to increase. I was talking about the Chinese that they want to take over for the dollar as the reserve currency. This crisis, like the crisis in 2008 and the COVID crisis, illustrate that the dollar is still the world's reserve currency, and that the largest capital market is in the US. So when in trouble, capital return to safe harbors in the US. This is the currency market indexed back to before the financial crisis. And as you can see, the Chinese currency has been very stable. And this is kind of cheating because China has a lot of trade surplus. So normally a trade surplus country would have a stronger and stronger currency. Russia, on the other hand, with the sanctions, have seen a deterioration of the currency, but they have introduced very heavy regulation on capital, and they have something to sell that the world needs, energy and raw materials and minerals. So even though the West have sanctioned about $300 billion in foreign reserve, they will get that back through the trade from non-sanctioned goods going forward. And the final, take a look at the trade balance on the US. They have slowed down the trade deficit with the Chinese economy in blue, but look at the red line. So the US is in trouble. They have very weak productivity growth. They are not so competitive that we would like to believe, and they have a trade deficit with the world. So I think trade tension, deglobalization, that you develop two kind of spheres with technology and trade and logistic systems, one Chinese/Russian and one West around the US economy. So with that, thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisabeth, for this update here. As I just came now also from the World Government Summit in the Emirates, where it was a lot of discussions around can we even think about climate and all the climate issue now if we don't have energy security, right? So, I mean, it's really the key here. Should we just like wait for doing more on sustainability and climate now and focus on that? I say, of course, we need to do all of it together, because now we have as a new chance, right, Elisabeth, to see how we can, in the new time that is emerging now after COVID and what's happening now with the war in Ukraine, but then having more focus on renewable energy, but more effective energy systems. Is that how you see it too?
Yes, and I think we have to embrace the new generation of nuclear power, and we have to listen to engineers and not just politicians with green ambitions, because ambitions and dreams are good, but we are competing with nations that are not interested in that. And we have to keep a strict eye on our own competitiveness, our own security, defense, and self-preservation as a civilization. So it's time to think in a little bit more realistic way than we have allowed ourselves to during the last decades. And in the West, we have been able to do that due to extremely low interest rate level, massive debt that's been used on a lot of not very productive investments. So invite in engineers and specialists on whole energy systems, not just the idealists. That's my advice for going forward.
So much, Elisabeth. We will have, after this digital session, we're going to have a bigger group here with